So, thank you, Susanna. As Susanna said, I run a Jane Austen podcast, and when we were doing our Pride and Prejudice season, I watched all the film adaptations I could get hold of. I really feel I took one for the team there. One thing that struck me was that while the Elizabeths in the adaptations are more or less similar, there's a huge amount of difference in the Darcys. They start from the character in the book, but they take him in all different directions. And I started thinking about how much these Darcys are products of their own time. In this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on the 5 readily available period adaptations of the book, the ones I've been able to actually watch. Those are the big pictures at the top. The smaller pictures are all the other ones that I'm not going to be talking about in detail, though I might mention some of them. When I gave this presentation at Jasna, it was on the second day. And on the first day, I went to a talk by Jess House on the Darcy Wars, where she talked about the Colin Firth versus Matthew Macfadyen fan bases. I then spent the evening adding this slide to my presentation. Jess talked about what she called the principle of centre of gravity for adaptations. The idea that no adaptation has true fidelity in how it presents the characters, but viewers who've read the novel are looking for aspects that they think are essential to the character. But different adaptations choose different Darcy essentials to focus on. This may be a conscious decision to present a character who will appeal to that particular audience, or it may simply be the filmmakers applying their own biases, or a bit of both. Some of the differences that I've found interesting in looking at all these adaptations are how Darcy's initial pride is presented, how we see his growing attraction to Elizabeth, and following from that attraction, there's also the question of how they deal with his change after being refused by Elizabeth. The balance between whether Darcy has reflected and changed versus it's only when Elizabeth sees him at Pemberley that she sees the real Darcy. But before I start on this, I just want to take a super quick look at Darcy in the original novel and the first stage adaptations. Objectively, a lot of his behaviour at the start of the novel could justify Meryton's opinion of him. And for most of the novel, we do only see him externally or filtered through Elizabeth's perceptions. But in the first scenes at Meryton and Netherfield, which is volume 1 of the book, we're actually told quite a lot about his feelings. I've put some examples on the slide, and I still remember when I was an undergraduate at Sydney Uni studying the book, Penny Gay drawing our attention to that one there on the bottom left, saying what you've got there is Darcy so terrified of his own feelings that he spends half an hour hiding behind a book. I think it's important that as readers we have already been set up to see that there's more to him than Elizabeth thinks. In volumes 2 and 3 we don't get inside his head at all, but these early insights help us engage with him from the start, and if they weren't there we might even not recognise him as the hero. So without these narrator comments, how do the adaptations ensure audience engagement? Well, it seems the early stage adaptations didn't. In her wonderful book, The Making of Jane Austen, Devaney Loza points out that in many of these, Darcy spent much of the play acting in ways that reinforced Elizabeth's most uncharitable views. But this changed in 1935 with Helen Jerome's adaptation, where the stage directions call for Darcy to display emotion. Colin Keith Johnson played the part on Broadway, and Devaney Loza says, surviving publicity stills suggest a Darcy designed to set hearts and all manner of female parts aflutter. Photos of the performance reveal Keith Johnson's unforgettable knee-bending pelvic tilt as he stands audaciously close to Elizabeth, which you can kind of see in some of those pictures. The production was very successful. It also went to London, where Darcy was played by Hugh Williams, and this may have actually set up expectations for Darcy to be presented as something other than just the personification of pride. There was a recording made of one of the performances, and also at a talk at the Jasna last year, Devaney Loza said that there is evidence to suggest that this recording was viewed by the makers of the 1940 film.
It's no use. I've struggled in vain. I must tell you how much I admire and love you.
So that was the start of the proposal scene in the 1940 MGM production with Laurence Olivier as Darcy and Greer Garson as Elizabeth. It was actually the first production I ever saw. It was an HSC text, and the local suburban cinema did a screening of that film. For audiences of the time, Olivier was fresh from starring in Wuthering Heights and Rebecca, and he brought matinee idol glamour to the role. That's why I've called him Matinee Idol Darcy. Olivier later said it was difficult to make Darcy into anything more than an unattractive-looking prig. But I think he was probably being a bit disingenuous. He must have known that his sheer presence was enough to get the audience on side with the character. But where Jerome's play had Darcy displaying passion, which Olivier certainly did when he was Heathcliff, in this production he imbues Darcy with charm. John Wiltshire described him as a smiling Darcy, whom Elizabeth may find charming. And I think you can see some of that in the proposal scene I played. That way he lets his hands just drop to his side as he acknowledges his feelings. It's almost boyishly appealing. This film was very much of its time, and I'm not just talking about the non-Regency costuming decisions. I think it's interesting to look at the taglines from these early ads, the poster and the trailer. We've got Bachelors Beware, The Merriest Manhunt, When Pretty Girls Teased Men into Marriage, and 5 Love-Hungry Sisters. They seem to be positioning the film as a screwball comedy, which is a rom-com subgenre that was big in the 1930s and early 40s. The comedy part of it could be slapstick, but it also featured lively repartee, strong female characters, and class-crossing relationships, none of which is a million miles from Pride and Prejudice. But because Darcy's reworked as an engaging screwball hero, I feel that the whole shape of his relationship with Elizabeth is changed. There's a lot more will they, won't they, as they seem to be coming together and then they get separated. This Darcy is clearly responding to Elizabeth from the start, and she knows it, and at times she responds to him as well. The most obvious is in the Netherfield garden party, which takes the place of the Netherfield ball. Darcy helps Elizabeth avoid Mr. Collins, then condescendingly offers her archery advice, only to find that she's more expert than he.
That's right. Bullseye. And another bullseye. Next time I talk to a young lady about archery, I wouldn't be so patronizing. Yes. Thank you for the lesson.
Thank you for taking it so well. Most men would have been offended, and rightly.
This exchange would have been inconceivable at this point in the novel, but I think it could have come out of the screwball comedy playbook, with its emphasis on capable women, witty banter, and a battle of the sexes. They're clearly connecting. But then Darcy draws back completely after overhearing Mrs. Bennet talking about Jane and Bingley, witnessing an inebriated Kitty, and being accosted by Mr. Collins. But this does mean that when he proposes, it's not actually coming out of nowhere. It's just another step in the same dance. But this time it's Elizabeth who draws back. The other really significant thing about this adaptation, to me, in relation to its presentation of Darcy, is the pacing. The first proposal happens about 70% of the way through the movie, and the ending is really truncated, with little chance to show Darcy having actually changed. There's no letter, and amazingly there's no Pemberley. And then we learn that he sent Lady Catherine, who turns out to be nice, to find out how Elizabeth felt about him. So it's a completely different trajectory, and we neither see him on his home turf nor get a real sense that the refused proposal made him take a good hard look at himself and decide to change. This changed story of an almost boyishly charming hero who messes up several times but eventually comes good sits well within the screwball genre, and it drew on Olivier's screen presence, so audience engagement with the character was assured. But he has shifted quite some distance from Austen's creation. There are a whole bunch of TV adaptations in the 1940s and 50s, most of which are no longer available. But quite recently, somebody put the 1967 BBC production up on YouTube.
In vain have I struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I love and admire you.
When we were doing Pride and Prejudice in the podcast, there are only a couple of scenes from this available on YouTube. So I was really excited to be able to watch the whole thing. But I'll admit I was also a bit nervous. Lewis Fiander, who plays Darcy, was an Australian actor, although not one I was familiar with. But I thought he might be to Darcy what George Lazenby was to James Bond when he played the part once only in 1969. You can see in these photos they're even wearing similar frilly white cravats. It's so late 60s, early 70s. And to be honest, it didn't start out well. He's got this bouffant hair. He was actually told to grow it for the part. And he's one of several cast members who have quite a declamatory way of speaking, which does seem a bit odd to 21st century ears. And unlike Olivier, he doesn't give us charm from the start. Instead, he looks disdainful of the company, which is consistent with the novel, but not all that appealing. But one interesting addition, it seems to me like there's more emotion under the surface that he's exercising self-control over, which is why I've called him Self-Control Darcy. In a not from the novel scene, Wickham turns up at the Netherfield ball, and Darcy approaches him with controlled anger.
I've long known you to be without scruples or sensibility. I now know you to be without shame either. You will either leave this house of your own volition or I shall have the servants remove you by force.
This isn't the Darcy we see on the page, although we might imagine it in his other dealings with Wickham. There are undercurrents of passion, although it's quite a different style of passion from Helen Jerome's Darcy in the Broadway play. But of course, the more important question is what we see of his feelings for Elizabeth. And this production does show us his changing emotions, even though Elizabeth doesn't pick up on it. At the end of the first episode, when she refuses his invitation to dance, he watches as she walks away, although the fuzzy transfer does make it kind of hard to discern his expression as he's doing this. But he's definitely relaxed with her by the time they're talking at Netherfield, and there's increased softness in his eyes and a smile after they've danced at the Netherfield ball. These changes to his facial expression take the place of the narrator telling us about his changing feelings. But they also fit in with a later moment in the novel, at Pemberley. When Elizabeth looks at Darcy's portrait, she sees that it has such a smile over the face as she remembered to have sometimes seen when he looked at her, and that's what we're getting with Fiander. You may remember from the clip I showed of the proposal that there isn't really a lot of passion to it. It's beautifully enunciated, but quite controlled, at times almost emotionless. Although there is anxiety in his eyes, which I think you can see in this still, and he takes a breath as if to psych himself up before saying, "You must allow me," so we're getting just a bit of vulnerability as well. He does move again to controlled anger when they're talking of Wickham, but I quite like this moment.
And this is your opinion of me? This is the estimation in which you hold me? I thank you for explaining it so fully.
It looks to me as if he's already processing and beginning to reflect on what Elizabeth has said. As in 1940, there's no letter. Darcy says most of it directly to Elizabeth, giving Fiander more scope to show his emotions. This time the Pemberley segment is included. Darcy walks in as they're admiring his portrait. So, as in the book, we see a more relaxed Darcy, as well as one who is protective of Georgiana, or Georgina as she's called in this one. And there's one extra scene. Darcy negotiating with Wickham in London. So no, Andrew Davis in 1995 wasn't the first person to do that. And another thing that's not as new as we might have thought, in this version, after the second proposal, we see Darcy and Elizabeth travelling to Pemberley, with his final line being, "Welcome home, Mrs. Darcy." You may not be aware, but in the 2005 film version, there was an extra scene added for the American audience, which has them at Pemberley and finishes on the line Mrs. Darcy, although the context is a little different from this one. We didn't get that scene here in Australia, and when I looked it up after seeing the movie, I was actually quite glad we didn't. I think the 1967 does a return to Pemberley much better. So in a lot of ways, this Darcy does map to the novel, although I think some of his stiff behaviour could be seen as self-control rather than pride, or at least that's how I like to see it. To be honest, I haven't really been able to come up with a theory as to how the historical context influenced this, although maybe I should observe that the very precise diction is probably typical of the period, and the extent to which he shows controlled anger may be a little bit concerning to modern viewers. But I also think the way Fiander's facial expression changes as he looks at Elizabeth makes it an interesting comparison to the 1995 version. However, before we get to that, there's the 1980 BBC production with David Rintoul as Darcy.
In vain have I struggled, it will not do, my feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you.
This actually seems to be a bit of an aberration in screen versions, as there's almost no effort to show us an inner Darcy. He's as opaque to the audience as he is to Elizabeth. I think the opening of his proposal, where he's almost devoid of emotion, is a good example. I've got this nice little book on screen adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, and as part of her research, the author, Deborah Cartmel, contacted Jonathan Powell, then BBC head of drama. He told her that at this time there was a sort of drama turf war between the BBC and ITV. They were both doing innovative productions like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy and Brideshead Revisited. Pride and Prejudice came between these two productions and was a more typical BBC adaptation for the time. Powell said it was chosen as a safe bet. In fact, he quoted a conversation with someone who told him, "Don't worry, if we're ever in trouble for not being populist enough with our choices, we just do Pride and Prejudice. The audience always turns up for that." It's also a very female-centric production. If you just look at that DVD cover compared to Tinker Tailor and to Brideshead. This was probably partly a differentiation strategy and partly due to the feminist views of screenwriter Fay Weldon. Deborah Cartmel feels that this adaptation privileges the relationship of Elizabeth and Jane above that of the obligatory heterosexual pairing of Darcy and Elizabeth. And again, if you look at that DVD cover, you can see how Jane and Elizabeth are in the foreground, whereas Darcy and Elizabeth are very much in the background. In this adaptation, you get a lot of voiceover from Elizabeth, often taken from narrator comments in the novel telling us what she's thinking. But those narrator comments about Darcy's emotions that I mentioned earlier, they aren't turned into dialogue or voiceover. They're just not there. We're not given a lot of insight through his facial expressions. Devoney Loza describes Rintoul's performance as an ultra-stiff attempt. This image on screen is from when he's listening to Mary play the piano, so we could expect him to look a bit disapproving. But this is him listening to Elizabeth playing the piano at Rosings, and it's pretty similar. And here's a series of stills from other key scenes in Hertfordshire and Kent. His facial expression and body language barely change. His face is invariably still with a slight frown, and he holds himself quite upright. There were a couple of moments when he smiled that I didn't include, but honestly, this is a much more general impression of what he's like. We don't know what he's thinking as he stalks around the room, often looking at the walls or out the window rather than at his companions. So the Darcy the audience sees is exactly the haughty Darcy that Elizabeth sees. Though to me at least, while there are certainly times when his words show that he feels he's above his company, the facial expression comes across not so much as stiffness but as extreme reserve, hence my calling him Reserved Darcy. I think we have to assume that this was a deliberate choice to maintain his remoteness, or maybe to keep the focus on Elizabeth. But it does make it difficult to engage with him, or really to want them to get together. Though there is one moment that I think was intended to try and humanise him. It's when he's walking to Hunsford to propose. The way that dog looks at him may be my single favourite moment in this production. But it's followed by that dispassionate proposal where he's often not even looking at Elizabeth. After she refuses him, there are brief flashes of anger and even hurt, but there's not a sense he's controlling deep emotions like Fiander was. For most of it, he receives her accusations with a completely impassive face. He seems almost constitutionally incapable of letting his feelings overcome his reserve. In this version, we do get the letter, but it's read out in an almost completely dispassionate voiceover by Darcy. And the visuals are almost entirely Elizabeth, interspersed with the occasional mid-shot of Darcy walking impassively. Just look at his posture in that shot. And then there are some long shots, showing him getting further and further and further away. They're going out of their way to keep him remote from us. We don't see him again until Pemberley, and we get a fraction of a second warning before he appears and some very dramatic music.
Elizabeth Bennet.
He's more relaxed at Pemberley. Not deep emotion, but at least he's not ultra-reserved anymore. In fact, at times he's almost chatty. But the mask returns with the news of Lydia and remains on in his visit to Longbourn. We have no idea what he's feeling. Even in his second proposal, he won't look Elizabeth in the eye. But when she accepts, he turns to face her and they walk together arm in arm. For some viewers, David Rintoul captures exactly the character of the novel. His extreme reserve is both very English and very Darcy. But for most people, Rintoul's legacy is a Darcy who's stiff and distant and never gives enough access to his emotions to make him a viable romantic prospect. This isn't a problem with the last two Darcys we're looking at.
In vain I have struggled. It will not do. My feelings will not be repressed. You must allow me to tell you how ardently I admire and love you.
The 1995 BBC series with Colin Firth has the longest runtime of any adaptation, so it's able to keep all of the plot points of the book. In fact, most of the changes that were made seem to be with the aim of focusing on Darcy's feelings and his development extrapolated from the novel. You can see that I've called him Sex Appeal Darcy, but there was another name I'd also been considering. Colin Firth is often credited with giving us socially awkward Darcy. At the Meryton Assembly, he looks not so much proud or reserved or aloof as uncomfortable and somewhat grumpy. He doesn't want to be there, and when Bingley pressures him to dance with Elizabeth, he responds with irritation. Colin Firth described his interpretation as, "I agree to go to a party with my friend Bingley. I'm terribly shy, terribly uneasy in social situations anyway. This is not a place I'd normally go to, and I don't know how to talk to these people. So I protect myself behind a veneer of snobbishness and rejection." There is actually support in the text for this interpretation. At Rosings, when Darcy's defending himself against Elizabeth's and Colonel Fitzwilliam's banter, and that's another scene where Firth's Darcy is visibly uncomfortable, he says, "I certainly have not the talent which some people possess of conversing easily with those I have never seen before. I cannot catch their tone of conversation or appear interested in their concerns, as I often see done." None of the earlier adaptations used social awkwardness as an alternative to pride, maybe because it's a concept that just wasn't in the public consciousness at that time. But I did a Google Books Ngram search on the phrase socially awkward. This is where Google gives you a graph showing usage of a word or phrase in all of its text corpora. And you can see from this graph that socially awkward had an exponential rise in usage from around 1991. And it does seem to have been in the zeitgeist of 1995. Let's take a look at that other 1995 adaptation, an episode of the children's TV series Wishbone, which looks at classic literature through a framing story of a young American boy and his dog, Wishbone.
Darcy. Mr. Bingley's rich and incredibly handsome friend, Mr. Darcy, is nervous at parties. So nervous, he seems rude.
Which is basically what Colin Firth said. This episode of Wishbone aired in the US on the 9th of November 1995, which is less than 2 months after the UK release of Pride and Prejudice and before the US release. So I don't think either of these productions influenced the other. It's a sort of parallel interpretation. But we have certainly seen it in other productions since. In 2004, Pride and Prejudice had an American Darcy who was well out of his comfort zone in India. The 2012-2013 web series The Lizzie Bennet Diaries actually spawned a fan portal entitled Socially Awkward Darcy. This series was interesting because we don't see Darcy for anything up to the first proposal. What we get is Elizabeth's mocking impersonations of him. So that line about not smiling, that does actually come from her, not from him. And most recently of all, in 2022's Fire Island, Will showed a combination of reserve and social anxiety. Even if you haven't seen it, I'm sure you can guess which of these three men is Darcy. Plus, of course, there's a 2005 film, which I'll be getting to later. I think one of the reasons Socially Awkward Darcy has caught on is that it's easier to forgive social awkwardness as a reason for his behaviour than it is pride. And as the Google Ngram showed, there's a lot more interest in it. But I also don't think we can discount the influence of Colin Firth. But even more than Socially Awkward Darcy, the 1995 production emphasised sex appeal Darcy. As Devaney Loza reminds us, this isn't the very first time it's been done, but it is perhaps the first time since Helen Jerome's Broadway play 60 years earlier. Darcy's first appearance is on horseback, which Andrew Davis, the screenwriter, said was intended to show him and Bingley as two physical young men. They are young animals on their big horses. I wanted the audience to get a sense fairly early on that there is a lot more to Darcy than Elizabeth sees. And then, still in the first episode, we see Darcy shooting, playing billiards, and taking a bath. Right from the start, he's being set up as the male animal romantic hero. Later on, there's also Fencing Darcy, Wet Shirt Darcy, and Mean Streets Detective Darcy, who successfully finds the fugitives in London. But Davis also said an aspect of Pride and Prejudice that he was struck by was that the story is driven by Darcy's sexual attraction to Elizabeth. And I think Darcy's sex appeal arises not just from his physicality, but from the insight we get into his emotional journey, which is something Lewis Fiander gave us in 1967, but here it's dialed up to 11. Though not to forget, it is still drawing on something that is already in the novel. It's one of those centres of gravity that Jess House was talking about. The novel's comments about Darcy's growing preoccupation with Elizabeth are shown here by how often he looks at her. In early such scenes, he has a slight frown, but in the gathering at Lucas Lodge, he gazes after Elizabeth, his eyes soft and the beginning of a smile on his face. The inscrutable frown sometimes recurs or is replaced by an expression indicating some kind of inner turmoil. But increasingly we see the smile, which at Rosings, after an initially disapproving look, becomes more pronounced when he's talking to her. When it comes to the first proposal, as you saw from the clip, and as I'm sure most of you remember anyway, Firth's Darcy is in a heightened emotional state, far more so than the earlier Darcys, and probably closer to the novel. In the dialogue that follows, his reactions are mirrored in his face and body language, and this is continued into the next episode as we see him feverishly writing his letter. We even get scenes between the proposal and the encounter at Pemberley that show he's still struggling with his emotions. But of course, the most well-known scene from this production is Wet Shirt Darcy walking back from the lake at Pemberley and unexpectedly encountering Elizabeth. This ties in with the male aspect that Davis wanted to emphasise. But I think it's not just for the eye candy. For me, it also serves the emotional story because it really highlights that sense of embarrassment that he and Elizabeth both feel and that we are given in the novel. Although in the novel it's almost overlookable, tucked at the end of a paragraph, here it's front and centre and you can't avoid it. Unlike previous Darcys, there's a sense of urgency in the post-embarrassment scene. You can just imagine him frantically getting changed before he rushes out to catch them before they leave. Firth said of Darcy that he needs to show her in about 3 minutes flat that he's prepared to be apologetic and tender and amenable and unsnobbish. He's just got to get a foot in the door and prove that he has tried to change those aspects of his nature that alienated her before. At Pemberley and at Lambton, he's doing everything he can think of to make her like him. Honestly, if he thought it would impress her to turn cartwheels, he'd probably try. He's welcoming to the gardeners, but he's nervous and careful with Elizabeth, making sure he doesn't overstep any boundaries. Just in that still image, look at how he's anxiously twisting the ring on his finger while he's talking to her. And you can see that he's desperately keen for her and Georgiana to hit it off. But once he's got that foot in the door, when they come to dinner at Pemberley, there's also the smile, which is now softer and more open. It's a naked display of his feelings. And after she leaves, we can see the hope and determination, first when he's talking to Carolyn, and then when walking around with the candle. As he remembers Elizabeth with Georgiana, you can see he's making plans. And I also love the moment when we see him choosing which coat to wear before calling on her. He does appear to withdraw upon learning about Lydia and Wickham, but unlike in the novel, and like in the 1967 adaptation, we're not left long in doubt as to his feelings, as it's in the same episode that we follow him to London. This production wants to keep the audience on side with Darcy, not spending a week between episodes thinking the worst of him. The final shot in this production is Darcy in the carriage with Elizabeth, leaving the church with a broad smile of delight on his face. His emotional journey, which began with a gaze, a softening of the eyes and a faint smile, has now ended in perfect happiness. And the viewer, who has been with him almost every step of the way, is invited to celebrate. Matthew Macfadyen's Darcy is another one not afraid to display emotion.
Miss Elizabeth, I have struggled in vain and I can bear it no longer. These past months have been a torment. I came to Rosings with the single object of seeing you. I had to see you. I have fought against my better judgment, my family's expectation, the inferiority of your birth, my rank and circumstance, all these things, and I'm willing to put them aside and ask you to end my agony.
I don't understand.
I love you.
This version keeps its focus almost entirely on the romance between Elizabeth and Darcy. But unlike the 1940 film, it doesn't dramatically change the character trajectory. Rather than turning the story into a screwball comedy, this film presents it as a capital R romance with stirring music and luscious cinematography and a mood that at times leads more towards the Brontes than to Austen. Darcy is again reinvented for a new century and an audience that extends into the young adult demographic. Macfadyen said that he viewed Darcy as a tortured adolescent. He's sort of all conflicted and torn up. On Darcy's first appearance in the film, Elizabeth remarked that he looks miserable, poor soul. So we're being explicitly told from the start how to interpret his somewhat dour, morose expression. This film came out in a decade that also saw publication of the Bronte-inspired young adult fantasy series Twilight, and the growth in usage of the adjective emo to describe a person who likes emo music, wears mainly black clothes, and is depressed, sensitive or emotional, often performatively so. You can see why I've called Matthew Macfadyen Emo Darcy. Wikipedia tells me that the genre of emo music began in the mid-1980s, but the concept of an emo person came later. Again, the Google Books engram of this time of emo teen. You can see the first use was in 2003, and then there was a rise even more exponential than we saw with Socially Awkward. But this is another socially awkward Darcy, just in a rather different way.
Will you dance, Mr. Darcy?
Not if I can help it.
Colin Firth's Darcy dislikes being in a crowd, would rather be elsewhere, and is annoyed with Bingley for bringing him to the assembly. Matthew Macfadyen's Darcy looks to me more like he doesn't know how to fit in, but he really wishes he could. As he looks sadly at the floor, it engages our sympathy, as well as emphasising that miserable positioning of this Darcy. We also get a bit of this in the scenes at Rosings, and then in the first proposal, when he defensively asks Elizabeth, "Are you laughing at me?" This Darcy is powerfully drawn to Elizabeth, but instead of softening from coldness into smiles, like Firth and to a lesser extent Fiander, for much of the film his face remains on a miserable setting, with occasional shifts into anger, defensiveness or anxiety. But having said this, I should note that from audience comments in Jess House's presentation at Jasna, some people do see a change in expression. So maybe I'm being a bit hard on him. After that presentation, I re-looked at this slide and I realised that you can see something in his face in that in that last screen grab on the slide where he's looking at her while she plays the piano. Although, arguably, you could also see it as just a tiny bit creepy stalkerish. His attraction to Elizabeth is shown predominantly through body language and physical response. And of course, the most memed example of this is the hand flex.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Elizabeth?
Apparently this actually originated with Macfadyen as part of his performance, but director Joe Wright picked up on it. "He saw me do it," said Macfadyen. "I remember him just going, 'Get that,' so they just did an extra shot on the hand." As I said, this production also uses cinematography, music and weather to create a sense of heightened emotion, sort of Bronte-esque romance 21st century style. The first proposal scene is an extreme tonal departure from the novel and the other adaptations. Rather than being indoors with Elizabeth and Darcy constrained by four walls and early 19th century propriety, you saw from the clip that this one is outdoors with both participants wet from the rain. This charged mood is emphasised by their dishevelled appearance and the tumultuous weather, while Darcy's declaration includes emotive language like torment and agony. During his argument, he steps very close to Elizabeth. They're not quite touching, but the sexual tension is palpable. The encounter at Pemberley is a complete contrast. Elizabeth is an unseen witness to his arrival and greeting by Georgiana. Gone is the morose, anxious Darcy. Now we see a relaxed and laughing young man. But when he sees Elizabeth, the awkwardness returns, along with another close-up of his hand when she departs. The focus is still on Darcy's emotional turmoil, but maybe not so much on the idea that he's undergone self-examination in response to Elizabeth's words. Even when Elizabeth and the gardeners call, his relaxed attitude, at least to me, seems to be driven more by the vivacious Georgiana than by any change he's made to himself for Elizabeth. The second proposal is even more of a tonal departure from the novel. Walking in the fields at dawn, wearing only a coat over her nightdress, Elizabeth sees Darcy, also casually attired, emerging through the mist. In keeping with this hyper-romantic approach, while Darcy initially uses words from the novel, he transitions into highly charged language.
You have bewitched me, body and soul, and I love and love and love you. I never wish to be parted from you from this day on.
The scene finishes with a close-up as Elizabeth takes his hands, he presses his forehead against hers, and the sun rises between them. In the DVD director's commentary, Wright says that this may be a bit over the top and a bit over-romantic and a bit slushy, but if we haven't earned it by now, then we never will have. Like MGM in 1940, it's moved a very long way from Jane Austen's text, and I think from Jane Austen's Darcy, but it is absolutely in keeping with the approach of the rest of the film. And I think it does what it's doing very well, and I will admit, this scene does suck me in every time, even though it's not at all Jane Austen. In Fitzwilliam Darcy, Jane Austen created a character whom readers have been engaging with for over 2 centuries. Her words can't be directly translated to screen, so filmmakers have to draw on other techniques to recreate the magic in a way that will resonate with their audiences. From the screwball comedy fans of the 1940s through to the twilighters of the 2000s, every generation of film goers and television watchers has different expectations of a lead character. An adaptation will always be the product of its time, and decisions of what to include, drop or change will be driven by an understanding of the audience as much as by a desire to find the essence of the character. Matinee idol Darcy, self-control Darcy, reserved Darcy, sex appeal Darcy and emo Darcy all combine Jane Austen's 1813 creation with the expectations of very different contexts. They give viewers unversed with the book a way into the character, while providing existing Austen fans with ideas to think about that may ultimately offer them new perspectives on the original character, whether they agree or disagree with the interpretation. I'll just finish with one last reference to Jess House's talk at Jasna. The Darcy Wars she was talking about was the battle between adherents of Colin Firth versus those of Matthew Macfadyen, which had a very strong generational split. She actually got the audience to go to one side of the room or the other, depending on which they were. Because of the demographics of Jasna, the split was about 3/4 Colin Firth, 1/4 Matthew Macfadyen. With a different demographic, you get a different split, obviously. But the interesting thing she said is that she has started to see in her younger students a swing back towards Colin Firth. It seems that Macfadyen's Darcy doesn't always speak to all of these younger fans in the same way he once did. I think we are now overdue for another period adaptation so that this generation can get its own Darcy. I would be fascinated to see what he's like. Thank you.
Hasn't she? Does anyone have questions they would like to ask Harriet?
Okay. The question was, who's my favourite Darcy? Well, first of all, when I talk about my favourite Darcy, I'm not trying to say any one of them is the best Darcy. I don't want to criticise anyone for their personal favourite. Doctor Who fandom says that your Doctor Who is the first one you saw. By that argument, it should be Laurence Olivier. By my generational argument, as a teenager of the 1980s, it should be David Rintoul. But I've got to say, for me, my Mr. Darcy is Colin Firth. But like I said, I actually do like all of them. Even Lewis Fiander, I was worried about at first, but he really engaged me by the end, in spite of all the limitations of the fuzzy transfer and the declamatory speech and everything. I thought he had something.
Yes, Darcy says, call me, I'm terribly shy, blah, 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 to Elizabeth. And she's, I think, on the piano playing and says, but, you know, you've had all that education, all of that, this, why on earth are you saying you like that? And I think she has a bit of a case for that. Have you any comment on that?
There has been, over the past couple of decades, a move towards, well, obviously socially awkward Darcy, as Colin Firth presented us, a move towards seeing Darcy on the autistic spectrum. And there was a wonderful talk given to Jasna by a woman who wrote a book about it, which was really exciting. I'm not personally a fan of applying modern psychological practices to fictional characters. Having said that, I have seen people talking on YouTube and wherever who are themselves on the autistic spectrum who actually really like that they can find something of themselves in Darcy. So I'm not going to tell anyone you can't see Darcy as socially awkward. And the book also says Elizabeth recognises that Georgiana is shy. So you could extrapolate from that, if you so chose, to say that family, they are shy. They possibly, with all that expensive upbringing, they weren't given the right support they needed to mix properly in social circles. But this is all speculation moving beyond the book, and I think if it helps you in your life, in your enjoyment of the book, if you like seeing Darcy as socially awkward, you go for it. But if you prefer to see him as proud and horrible and changing himself for the love of Elizabeth, that's fine too.
Michelle.
Was it originally, did Jane Austen call it Pride and Prejudice, or did she have another title?
What we believe was the original version was called First Impressions. We don't know the extent to which she changed it by the time she reworked it as Pride and Prejudice many years later. She does say that she lopped and cropped it, which could mean anything. There is an argument that it may have originally been epistolary format. Again, we don't have absolute definitive evidence for that. But yes, the original title was First Impressions, not Pride and Prejudice. There was another book written at the time, I can't remember its name, I'm sure Susanna can, that talks about Pride and Prejudice.
Sally Burney's novels, Camilla, I think, which has the phrase Pride and Prejudice. And we know Jane Austen read Fanny Burney, so she almost certainly got it from there.
And the word pride is absolutely used in connection with Darcy. Even at the end, Elizabeth says, to her father, indeed he has no improper pride. She doesn't say to him, indeed he has no pride. And Mary has drawn a distinction between pride and vanity. Again, we don't necessarily have to say Darcy doesn't have pride, he's just socially awkward. I think it's all in there for us, and that's the richness of the book. We can take what we want from it.